Hello and welcome to the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence, a documented Underground Railroad site located in Albany, New York. My name is Mary Liz Stewart, and I would like to share a little bit of time with you talking about Underground Railroad history. When you think of the Underground Railroad, what comes to mind for you? Many people have heard and to think about the Underground Railroad as a string of safe houses and routes. There were safe places for slaves escaping slavery to find freedom. I would like to challenge that notion and ask you to walk with me to consider that there is more to the story to understanding the Underground Railroad. I would propose to you that the Underground Railroad was a network of abolitionists, black abolitionists with their white allies, offering assistance to freedom seekers who exhibited or exerted self-agency to escape conditions of enslavement, and that the Underground Railroad really was a movement of civil disobedience, and it was an international movement. And I'd like to illustrate that by looking at one artifact I'd like to share with you. Traditionally, when the word artifact is used, it refers to material culture, objects left behind by people of the past, oftentimes buried in places not visible to the naked eye, and they are objects that help us better understand the life ways of people who came before us. I have two examples here. This plate, this piece of a plate that I'm holding in front of me for you to see, this is commonly the type of artifact that is often thought of when we use the word artifact. Another artifact, again commonly thought of, is something like this jug. And both of these objects, when read by an archaeologist, can tell us an incredible amount about those individuals who lived at the time period when these artifacts were made. But I'd like to share with you that the definition of artifact is actually broader than that. I would like to include in our definition of artifacts historic documents, historic buildings, even the remnants of food that can be identified in layers of soil and in jugs such as this, that again help us understand the life ways of people who came before us. So let's take a look at a particular document very significant to the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence. Let's look at it as an artifact and see what it can tell us about the Underground Railroad movement. This historic document behind me on the wall is the document that I'd like to share with you. The title of it, as you can see, is Vigilance Committee Office. Now, this particular document, very large here on the wall, is a poster size of an 8.5 by 11 flyer that was originally published in 1856. Do you take flyers home from school? Have you received flyers in your hand when you're out shopping? What is the purpose of a flyer? Flyers are given to us and passed out publicly so as to share information about something someone thinks is important to share. Well, before we read this out loud together, I want you to keep in mind that this document, again, blown into poster size for the purposes of hanging it on this wall, this particular flyer was a public document. Please read aloud with me the information contained in this public document, this flyer. We start at the top. Vigilance Committee Office, 198 Lumber Street, Albany, New York. At a meeting of the Vigilance Committee of Albany held on the evening of the 27th of April, 1856, it was resolved that we, the Vigilance Committee, appreciate the untiring efforts of our chairman, Stephen Myers, on behalf of the fugitive for the last 3 years. The following resolution was offered by the Reverend John Sands of Albany. Resolved that we tender to Mr. Stephen Myers our sincere thanks for his faithfulness in the proper expenditures of all funds placed at his control for the benefit of the fugitive, and in accordance with the instructions of the committee. From the 12th day of September, 1855, to July 15, 1856, 287 fugitives passed through Albany. Paid for passage, $542.36. Board, $76.70. T. Elkins, Secretary. C. Brooks, Chairman. We call on our fellow citizens here and elsewhere to aid us in funds to help the poor, unfortunate fugitives who come to us daily, in many cases destitute of clothing, weary of traveling, and hungry. No one is so poor as to be unable to give a little to this downtrodden class. We appeal to the sympathy of ladies and gentlemen everywhere. We are in want of material aid and cast-off clothing. All funds forwarded to Stephen Myers, William H. Topp, or any gentleman of the committee will be faithfully applied. All letters directed to this office will be duly answered. Reverend J. J. Kelly, Agent. Stephen Myers, General Agent and Superintendent. Committee: Reverend John Sands, Captain A. Johnson, William Gardner, Richard Wright, Stephen Myers, William Matthews, Minos McGowan, Lumber Merchant, South Pearl Street, James Wood, Dr. T. Elkins. And there's more. By the Underground Railroad. One day last week, a party of 16 escaped slaves arrived in Canada and found quarters in Stanford Township. One of the waiters at the Clifton House near the Suspension Bridge, who escaped 2 or 3 years ago from bondage in Virginia, was surprised of the coming of the party and exerted himself to procure them a resting place. It so happened that he had told the tale to a gentleman at the hotel who was his master's neighbor in Virginia. The recognition was mutual and instantaneous. They passed through Albany on the 13th July, Albany, July 1856. Something that I'd like you to think about is what sounded unusual to you in our reading of the Vigilance Committee flyer. What surprised you? What information seemed new to you? Was there something that seemed odd or didn't fit with what you understand to be the Underground Railroad? This document is a very rich artifact and provides us with some insight into this much larger story, the Underground Railroad movement. First, let's think about this document as a flyer, a public document. That stands in opposition to the notion that everything about the Underground Railroad was secret. And that idea has some merit to it, has some truthfulness to it. There was a need to engage in some secrecy to protect the abolitionists, to protect the freedom seekers. But there also was a very public side to the Underground Railroad movement. And this document, the Vigilance Committee flyer, is one example of the public side. Why do you suppose abolitionists who were breaking laws in New York State, where the Stephen and Harriet Myers residence is located, and they were breaking federal or United States laws, engaging in providing assistance to freedom seekers. Why do you think they would hand out a flyer that was public? Their names are on that flyer. What could they be thinking, and what was their purpose? I would venture to say that our abolitionists were very interested in standing up to what they believed was a very unjust system of laws that held human beings in bondage, that oppressed human beings, that refused to allow them to take advantage of the benefits of living in the United States, that according to the preamble to the Declaration of Independence, the founding document of the United States, indicated that all people in this country had a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. How can 4 million people be denied the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? That was a question our abolitionists asked themselves. And that was in answering that question, they found that one way to do that was to provide assistance to freedom seekers, which meant they were breaking the law. I'd like now to invite Paul Stewart, co-founder with me of Underground Railroad Education Center, to join us and share some additional information about this Vigilance Committee flyer. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you. Thank you.
So what else can you tell us about this important artifact of the Underground Railroad movement?
Well, this is a document that does tell us a lot about the Underground Railroad. It's about the Vigilance Committee, which was a committee of citizens who came together. After about 1835, vigilance committees started popping up in cities all around the north. And these are committees of citizens who got together to provide food, clothing, shelter, sometimes medical help and legal help to those who were escaping from enslavement and making their way to freedom. This flyer here represents the committee that was based in the city of Albany, but they had a wide area of responsibility or jurisdiction around the area. So their importance is more than just simply that they were in the city of Albany. The people who were involved on this committee were active in meetings and rallies and other kinds of activities all around the region, down in the city of Hudson, in the city of Troy, possibly even in the city of Saratoga Springs. So the Vigilance Committee was fairly important in terms of this area and the work that was going on.
Did Vigilance Committee that had its base here in Albany, did the members of that committee interact with vigilance committees in other locations?
Yes, they did. As a matter of fact, Stephen Myers is known to have written a letter to the Vigilance Committee in Boston to ask what kind of help and interaction the two committees could have together. They were also involved with the committees down the Hudson River in New York City. So there were many other committees that they were interacting with.
Now, were these Vigilance Committee members as well involved in any way with advocacy, abolition work in Canada or in the United Kingdom?
Well, yes, as a matter of fact, Stephen Myers and Thomas Elkins and William Topp were very much involved in interacting with the refugee communities in Canada, in Ontario and in Toronto in particular. They visited the communities there and they went to see just how they were doing and how they were progressing, and that they had interaction with all of those folks as well.
Now, did every freedom seeker who approached members of the Albany Vigilance Committee, did every freedom seeker go to Canada?
No, as a matter of fact, we have some very interesting stories. There's one story that I think is really outstanding, and that is a lady who had been through Philadelphia and had been seen by William Still in Philadelphia, who was the head of the Vigilance Committee, worked there, and she made her way to Albany, and she settled on Grand Street, and she wrote a letter through a friend to William Still, explaining to him that she was very thankful for the help that was provided in Philadelphia, that she had found a place to settle here, and she had gotten work, and she was really establishing her life here.
So it sounds to me as if everything about the Underground Railroad was not secret.
Not secret in the way that we imagine it to be. You know, I sort of chuckle when I see these pictures of a group, a family escaping from enslavement, and they're going across the hillside. The moon is up in the sky and it's fully bright, and they're carrying a lantern. I suspect that that didn't happen. You know, yes, maybe, you know, if the moon was out, the lantern probably wouldn't have been lit. You know, and if they were making their way, they probably wouldn't have been using a lantern, because that would be too easy to spot them in the night.
Now, were there slave catchers in the city of Albany? I've heard it said by some people, well, the city of Albany in New York State is so far north of southern plantations that it was a very safe place to be.
Well, it wasn't safe. There was always concern. And we do have stories recorded of slave catchers that came up into the city of Troy, and other reports about slave catchers who went all the way to Rouse's Point and places north like that. So it was something but there was some concern for people, even in Albany.
Now, I understand as well that New York State, so often cast as a northern free state, as if it's a safe haven, that it was a very strong pro-slavery state until it abolished the institution of slavery within its borders in 1827. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and even after that, there were many people in New York State who had financial interests in the South and who were connected to slavery. It's been more recently, people have been talking about the fact that even within New York City was a haven for people who had escaped from enslavement, and yet there were people in New York City who made it their business to kidnap blacks and sell them south. There were also insurance companies and shipping companies and manufacturing companies that had interests in the South, and so tended to be sympathetic to enslavement.
Well, this sounds like a much more complicated, complex story than we usually hear about in our classrooms and is retained in public memory.
That's absolutely right, Mary Liz.
So I think in light of our respect for time, we will have to close our commentary here. I'd like to thank you, Paul, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And I'd like to thank all of our viewers for joining us today as well. And what I would ask you to do is to identify for yourself, what is the takeaway you have from sharing in this video, in this information with us? What is it that, what is it about the Underground Railroad that is now new information that you have learned? What would you share with someone else that's fascinating to you now or surprising? I will ask you to think about that, and hopefully you will continue to learn more about the Underground Railroad, and hopefully we'll be able to have some additional sharing time virtually, as we did today, where we can delve into some of the other aspects of this fascinating Underground Railroad movement.